and welcome back to another episode of Tech Pro Unicorn. I am your host, Michael Grace, and today I am joined by Bill Flynn. Bill has pitched Steve Jobs, was tracked down by Alan Mulally, the CEO of Ford and Boeing. He's failed many times. He's succeeded more than most and has garnered many lessons from 30 years of studying the science of success. Bill's worked for and advised hundreds of companies, including startups, where he has a long track record of success in multiple industries. He's been a VP of sales 8 times, twice a CMO, once a GM of a division of a $100 million IT services company before he pivoted to becoming a business growth coach in 2015. Bill's a multi-certified coach, including MG100, has a certificate with distinction from the Foundations of NeuroLeadership, is a certified predictive index partner, author, and international speaker. Bill's best-selling book, Further, Faster, The Vital Few Steps That Take the Guesswork Out of Growth, continues to garner a 5-star rating. Bill, thanks for taking the time to join us here on the podcast.
Michael, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So that's quite a career, quite a list of accomplishments. And one would say you've reached the top of a person's career aspiration several times.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's funny. I used to be a Vistage speaker for about 3 or 4 years, and the bio was read off similar to that one. And the guy sitting next to me, who was probably about 75 years old, turned to me and said, "How old are you anyway?" So I guess I like to put my hands in lots of things. So
that's very cool. I mean, right? You kind of rose to success. I love that you humbly admit that you failed as well, because I think sometimes people focus on, wow, look at how successful, and he's successful, and they don't. Oftentimes that failure gets hidden, perhaps, or brushed under the carpet, and people focus on the great successes. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to business, and why did you pivot with all the success? Why did you pivot and go out and become a business coach?
Sure. So I did a bunch of startups, as you said. I'm here in the Boston area, so there's just a great opportunity to do startups. You got MIT and Harvard and a bunch of other great universities who just spew out entrepreneurs on a regular basis. I read somewhere that MIT is responsible for more startups per year than any other university, including Stanford, in the world. So there was that opportunity, and I just found that I loved them. I just loved the puzzle. I like puzzles. That's sort of my thing. The way my brain works, it likes that kind of stuff. And I think startup is just a big puzzle, and you're just trying to figure something out that no one's ever done before, and that's just kind of fun. And I'm a bit of a geek, so high tech is a nice place to apply that. So I did that for 25 years. As I think you said, I did 10 of them. At one point, I was 5 for 6, which is just like a crazy number because most startups fail, and to have an 85% or whatever that number is hit rate, it's pretty good. And to me, a hit rate it had to be at least 2x of the original investment. Sometimes it was 10 to 100x, but it had to be at least 2x. If it didn't do that, I didn't count it. But then, of course, I ended up as 5 for 10. So the last 4 were not so good, and there was a lot of failure. I have my theory on why that happened, and that certainly was one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing now, is pivoting as a coach. My theory is that it's a lot easier now to start a company than it was when I started doing this in 1991. Supposedly, I read somewhere that to start a company in the 90s, it cost about $15 million just to start a company, because you had to rent an office space and you had to do all this stuff. We didn't have AWS and all of these things that were available to us. The same company today to start would cost, I think they said it was like $100,000. And it was like a fraction of the cost. And I think that's actually a good thing and a bad thing, because now almost anyone can start a company. And I don't think anyone should start a company. If you have an idea, that's not a reason to start a company. You should be trying to solve a problem, not just coming up with an idea. And a problem is worthy of solving. But that doesn't always happen. And that started, I think, in the mid to late 90s, where these businesses were being birthed on, cocktail napkins and things, because people are investing in anything. The epitome of that is pets.com, right? Which had the sock puppet in the 90s, if you remember that one. And or Webvan that went through, hundreds of millions of dollars and did nothing of any value.
I loved Webvan.
Yeah,
I still have in my garage, they're yellow totes that say Webvan. I should probably eBay them or something. But I thought it was a great concept that just didn't
yeah,
really have a great business
the
plan
idea is
and
good, right? Of course, as we have it today,
totally
and the
busted.
pandemic really showed that it was a wonderful idea, right? Because I get everything delivered to me. Um, so that's sort of my journey, my first arc of my career, and I became a coach because between startup 5 and 6, I had an experience where I basically became a coach, and I didn't know I was being a coach at the time. I'm kind of Socratic in my approach anyway, so I'm always asking lots of questions and not trying to give answers as much. And in this case, I was forced to do that. I was a GM of an email hosting company in 2008, which was always a fun time to do anything. I had taken over because the founder brought me in about a year or so earlier and said, I want to sell this thing. Can you make me look bigger? And as a sales and marketing guy, I went in and put in processes, hired people, did all sorts of things. And about a year or so later, it was sold. And he did pretty well. It wasn't a huge sale. I don't think it was less than $20 million or something, but it was decent for him. And my first day as the GM, officially as the GM, which was January 4th, 2009, which I often describe as the best and the worst day of my professional life. We didn't deliver email to anyone. The entire technical infrastructure collapsed on itself because everyone came back from the holidays and wanted to do their email, and we weren't ready. So we lost like 1,000 customers out of about 7 or 8,000 in a week. And
Wow.
I and the new president of the other company that bought us had to go around and save our big partners, which were billion-dollar companies. We had Ingram Micro as a partner and Endurance International, which recently, last few years bought Constant Contact. These are some big partners, and we were this tiny little company. And I had 60 people in the division, and I had to, and they were getting yelled at, and so I had to do something. So I basically cobbled together this little system from things I had read over the years and some really good CEOs that I had come across, and it worked. It worked wonderfully well. But the premise of the system was, hey guys, I don't really know how to do most of what we're doing here. I've never run a technical infrastructure before. I have no finance background. I'm a pretty good sales and marketing guy, but I've never run tech support before. I'm kind of geeky, but I've never done that. So I said, look, let's get together and discuss, debate, and decide on what this thing looks like when we come out of it. And then I asked each of them to draw the map from their perspective of where their team was and where they were to that ideal outcome. And then we'll all work together to help each other get there. And that worked phenomenally well. We actually, I think the business doubled in size in about 2 years. I didn't lose one employee. Our customer satisfaction ratings went from a 2.9 to a 4.6 out of 5. This was before
Wow.
Net Promoter was really a thing. Net Promoter was just coming into being in around 2007, 2008. So I made up my own system out of 5. Just tell us how we're doing out of 5. So the resume looks great from that perspective. But the best part of the whole thing, and really the reason I'm a coach, is 2 of the guys that were on the team with me they weren't young, but they were young at managing people and certainly had never been in this chaotic situation before. And the day I left, they both sort of said the same thing to me, which was, I just want you to know that thing you made me do, that map from where we were to where we want to go. He said, I hated doing that. It was really, really hard. But I'm so glad you made me do it. Because now I know how to do it, right? It gave him the confidence, sort of taught him to fish, right? And also we worked as a team. We didn't just say, okay, great, good luck, and let us know when you're done. We worked together as a team to make it happen. And I wanted more of that. I wanted more of that kind of feeling that, that I got from that statement. I really helped someone. I didn't give them answers. I helped them to help themselves, which was really cool. And that's basically what I think a really good coach does, right? They don't, once in a while you'll give answers or direction or advice, but pretty rarely you should be doing that. You're trying to help them figure out the best version of themselves. So that's how I pivoted into what I do. I'm a leadership team coach. Even though I'm in Marshall Goldsmith's organization, he's an executive coach, and those of you who know him, he's like the number one executive coach in the world and has been for like a decade. Um, I don't really do that. I'm more like Bill Campbell, which most people don't know. Bill Campbell was the team coach for the folks at Google and Apple and Intuit and a whole bunch of other high tech folks on the West Coast. He died in the last few years, and a book was written about him. So he never wrote anything down. And Eric Schmidt, who was the chairman of Google, wrote a book with another guy called The $1 Trillion Coach. And it shows you everything that Bill Campbell does, which really works on teams and making the team a better thing. And that's what I do. I'm a leadership team coach. So that's sort of my origin story and how I got to here today.
I love it. And thank you for sharing that. So many people, don't share the struggle, which is very real, right? The struggle is real.
Yeah.
The struggle is very real, personally, professionally, when leading companies. And we all go through the darkest of days, right? And hopefully the ones that are triumphant come out on the other side. So I also coached a lot of small businesses, and I used to say the best thing that I ever did was stop people before they started, right? People with what they thought was a great idea, and so they got to open a business or they've got to, and then when you walk them through kind of like all the questions and the business planning and such, you're like, you're not going to make any money. And they're like, no, this is a great idea. It's a great idea. It's not going to make any money. So you're going to lose money. And as long as it becomes a passion project and you don't care about feeding your family and such, then yeah, this is a great idea. And I used to say the best advice I ever gave was don't start. Right.
Yes.
Because it's the barriers. I love what you said. Like anyone can start a company. That doesn't mean anyone should. Right. The barrier to entry has become so low. And so many people are like, oh, I'm going to start this business. I'm going to start. And they just flame out. Right. If
Yeah.
you go look at like the trademark registry, all these people pay their $35 and register trademarks and stuff. And then a year later, they're all expired, right? Because the business never made it.
Yep.
Or to watch the web domains, all these domains, they got all these domains, and then they only last a year, and then they flame out because the business never made it. Finding a good business coach to help you with an idea and figure out whether or not it's profitable or sustainable, or is there a demand for it? I love what you said about, are you solving a problem? What a great indicator. Like, I have this great thing. Well, no, you're not solving anyone's problem. They probably aren't going to be interested in it.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of people, and it may be actually a problem they have, but it may be so far down their stack that it's not worthy of solving yet, because it's just not something. It's just not important to them. I do this thing even beyond that. So I was a visitor speaker, as I said, for a number of years, and I would basically do the same workshop over and over again. And my workshop was basically questions, and I would ask them things. And so I probably met with 300, 400, 500 CEOs over that time frame, and I would ask the same question, which is, what is your customer value proposition? And I would have them all write it down, and they would all read it out loud to each other. And there's usually 15, 16, 20 people in the room. So everyone would read. And then I would be at the head of the room, and I had a little card, and I would be marking my card down. And they didn't know what I was doing. And I had a W and a T. And whenever they started their customer value proposition, which is basically, well, we make widgets. We do this. And I would put it under the W, right? And then when they said, well, our customer is really struggling with this thing, so this is how we solve it. And I would put it under T for they, right? They were talking about we or they. And guess what the ratio of W's to T's was? It was horrible. It was like 80, 90% W's and very few T's. And I was liberal. If they even just said anything about the customer, I would give them a T. And I would say something. I don't know that I think my scores were affected because I was sort of a slap in the face to some of these guys. And for those of you who don't know, Vistage is a peer-to-peer advisory organization, And some of these companies are big, and they've been around for generations. Hundreds. One company was well over 100 years old. Some of them were hundreds of millions, if not like $1 billion inside. These are big companies, right? So there's some egos in the room. And I would say, basically, you did this, and I just want you to know, nobody cares what you do. Your customers do not care what you do. They care what you do does for them. And until you have an empathetic and compassionate view of what you do for them, you'll never fully satisfy them because you're making it about you and not about them. And as soon as you make it about them, you're in a much better place to really try to figure out if you're solving a problem worth solving, if you're solving it fully in a way that you aren't doing yet. Because we as especially as entrepreneurs, it's just a small matter of programming. We used to say it's called SMOP in high tech, right? In software. So you could just solve it, but you shouldn't necessarily solve everything you can solve. You want to make sure that the best companies typically go deep first. They really get deep into the problem and solve it all the way down, and then they go out. But most companies don't do that. They try to chase revenue, and they keep going wider and wider and wider. And I like to say most businesses fail, and they don't fail of starvation. They fail of indigestion. They try to do too many things, and then something like 9/11 happens, or 2008, or COVID, and those that are stretched too thin die because they're just not ready. So it's definitely something I've seen not only in startups but also in companies that are beyond startup.
It's interesting, right? Because many companies, we kind of talk about that they're kind of fly by night, or they start and don't make it, or and it's hard to analyze why, right? Like why did they, And I think you just laid out a couple key points. Like they come up with a product that maybe is I love that analogy of like, well, we do this, we do that. Yeah, but does anybody care? Does anybody want that?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that you do that if nobody wants it, if you don't have a consumer. I used to love when people tell me like, oh, my car is worth this. Well, only if you have a buyer
Right.
that's willing to pay that,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Like, 'cause I wouldn't buy it for that. Or people tell me, like, oh, I have this and it's worth, this card and it's worth $10,000, like for a baseball card. And I'm just like, not to me, it's
Yeah.
not.
Right.
It's worth maybe $2 or $3, So alignment is kind of the word that's coming to my mind between, the sellers or the business and the consumers, and making sure that you really understand what they're asking for and that your products are meeting that need.
Yeah, and I think a really good example is Waze and Google Maps, which I use all the time. Which is, Google definitely made a better map than MapQuest, and they basically put them out of business. But they didn't really make a ton of money off of it. And then Waze came along and said, "Why do people use maps? What problem do they solve using maps?" And a big problem they solve, especially those pre-COVID, was commuting or getting from point A to point B on time. That was the job they hired. One of the jobs they hired a map to do for them. So then they said, okay, if that's what we're trying to solve, how would we solve it? With all the technology and knowledge and assets that we have available to us, how would we solve it? And they took two or three things together and said, okay, we have these phones, which are all interconnected and can talk to each other. We can bring them together. The phone has a gyroscope in it. It has an accelerometer in it. And it's all these things that we can use. Okay, let's build this thing, which will have a map in it. But I use Waze all the time. I rarely look at the map. Maybe when I want to take a corner or something, I'm like, okay, where is it? Is it coming up? But where Google Maps, you're constantly having to look at the map. And I think they were 5 years in, and Google bought them for well over $1 billion. Why? Because they really looked at, where are people struggling, and how can I help them with their struggle? Google would argue very well, yeah, we made a really good map, right? Our map is better, it's clear, it's nicer, it's crisper, it's whatever, it's got all these things. We got the traffic thing in there and other stuff, but it wasn't really solving the problem, or at least one of the problems that people had. And they paid dearly for it. Literally.
Yeah, Waze is interesting, right? Waze had a patent on not a map, right? Because they weren't first to the game. They had a patent on, they would take, when you signed up for Waze, whether you knew it or not, you were allowing kind of a two-way communication with that app. And your position, your speed, your all the accelerometer stuff, right? All the data about you driving on this route was communicated back to Waze and shared with the community, essentially.
Yep.
So that drivers behind you knew that you were doing 7 miles an hour. Oh, there's traffic. Whether you use some of their cool features to report slow traffic or not, Waze, the application, knew that, and Google to get that feature and functionality, because people were using Waze like crazy,
Yeah.
starting to use less of Google Maps, definitely less of Apple. Apple didn't have that either. Apple very much had what Google had, which was, hey, here's a map and here's the route, and basically here's kind of how you get there in estimated time, but it wasn't taking real time data into effect. And as a technology geek, right, I was like, wow, that is just an unconscionable amount of data being fed up into some cloud that then has to be processed and spit back out at a ridiculous rate for it to be valuable. And it ran, kind of funnily, or humorously, it ran on the Oracle cloud. From an architecture
Oh, did it?
perspective.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
When Google made the acquisition, it was this weird, like, okay, we need to get out of the Oracle cloud, because we're Google and we can't have it on the Oracle cloud. So from a technology perspective, that was fascinating, and we can geek out about the technology, but the business problem is really, what led to Waze. It was the most accurate, up to date, real time, get around traffic, get where you're going, which was the problem they were solving. It was awesome.
Yeah, they asked a better question.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's
in the book, the book Further Faster, you talk a lot about how a leader, specifically the CEO, must fire himself from the day to day.
Yes.
Which is kind of, oftentimes they rise up from the day to day. That's their comfort zone. That's where they want to go. Why is that so important? And how do they kind of go about doing that?
Sure. So it's super important because and this sort of leads into one of your other questions, I think, which is, what is the job of a leader? And I think you basically have two jobs. One is to create this environment for what some folks call human flourishing, right? Getting the best out of your team and your team members. Creating that environment of psychological safety, of innovation, of whatever, putting them in the best positions to take fullest advantage of their strengths, and mitigate or eliminate their weaknesses whenever possible. And the other, which will lead to this, which is you gotta tell them where we're going, right? If you're a leader, you attract followers. And I know this is sort of a leadership podcast, and I have a bit of a contrarian view. Is I don't think leadership is actually something that is repeatable, right? It's not a thing. I think followership is a thing. We should study followers and why they follow leaders, because leaders are all different, right? Mulally is different than Gates, is different than Ellison, is different than they're all very different. Jobs, they sort of they all have their faults and they all have their idiosyncrasies, but for some reason, a number of people have decided to forgive them of those things, or ignore them, because there's so much more gravity pulling them for something else, be it cult of personality or idea or vision or whatever it is. So you have to basically tell them, where are we going? But you have to create this process. So that's a creation process. That's innovation and insight. So I'm a really practical guy. So how does insight happen? And so I'll ask this of you, which I ask of everyone. When you get your best ideas, Michael, what are you usually doing?
Yeah. Usually like walking, I'm active. I'm kind of freed from the day to day, and my mind's allowed to wander.
Exactly. Yep. I hear in the shower, on a bike ride, on a run, and you actually added something, which is what I learned. So I'm a bit of a neuroscience geek. And if you look back at the history of our brains are tied to movement. Cognition and movement are connected. We used to walk supposedly about 12 hours a day on average. 12 miles a day. Sorry, 12 miles a day. And so our brain is used to that, right? So it likes the movement, and that often spurs innovation. So you can't be doing, so our brain cannot focus fully on more than one thing at a time. And I know I have a lot of women out there that say, no, I can do multiple things at a time. Well, it's not, you can't do them at the exact same time. It's called context switching. You can context switch really fast, but you're moving your attention from one thing to another. And, and I say this to people, I ask them all the time. I said, when you're driving and you're trying to find an address, do you ever turn the radio down? And most people do, because, it's distracting them from something else. So they remove their focus from the radio, which is distracting them to the other thing. And that's it's almost impossible not to do that, because that's how our brain works. So if you're doing all the time, right? If you have a line outside your door and you're the problem solver, you're the shell answer man, right? You're always doing everything. There's no way you'll give your brain enough time to create insight, which is really a fusing of neurons and synapses together through relatively disparate ideas. That's when it happens. And so in order to do this prediction of the future, which is basically, this is a design model, right? You're designing something for the future. You need to put your brain, and you need to relax your brain. You need to give it time to just sit and think, as you said, wander. So in order to do that, you need to fire yourself from the day to day as much as possible. When I speak to those leaders that I mentioned earlier, or when I spoke to them, I would ask them, give me a percentage, a ratio of time you were in the business versus on the business. And I would say almost to a man, it was between 80 and 90% in and 10 to 20% on. And I said, if you really want to make sure that you're creating the future for yourself and not guessing so often at it, you need to flip that ratio. You need to find a way to get rid of stuff that you're doing. Teach your team how to do it, or stop doing it, or whatever, so you can spend more time on predicting or really creating the future of the business, which is going out and talking to customers and learning what's going on in the market and read a lot and do all these things, because then you're filling your mind with all these great ideas. And once in a while, two of them will connect when you have relaxed. That's when things happen really well. So that's why you need to fire yourself in the day to day. And the same thing for your team, your leadership team, not as much as you, but definitely they have to do it as well.
I think a great example of that is if anyone ever watches Undercover Boss, right? And you take these CEO level folks and they go undercover. I just watched it last night. My daughter happened to be watching it. It was Marco's Pizza, the CEO, and he's down at the lowest level. They're a rapidly expanding East Coast pizza chain. And he was like, I had no idea our delivery truck drivers delivered to our stores in the middle of the night, had keys to open them and bring stuff in. And there's all this, they're not in the greatest neighborhoods necessarily. And he was just like totally blown away. And then he's like, I've got to fix this. Right. Like, and he was just, he's so, distant from the day to day, which I guess is good. But then, he had all these great solutions. I mean, all these great ideas, and it was because he was just out of his element. He really, and then he met with customers and other employees, which inspired him to do other things, and like totally not necessarily what you'd consider the traditional job of a CEO, which is probably to be back-to-back meetings all day long and talking about budgets and finance and all kinds of other boring things. When these CEOs get out of that element and get down to the where the meet the customers and understand, they have a pulse on what's going on in the business and can do really cool things.
Agreed. Yeah, I think you hit on a really good point, which is what I say to them is, you need to fire yourself from the day to day, because you need to get in touch with the two most important constituencies in your business, which are your customers and your team members. I'm a big fan of, get up and walk around or travel to places, and, start, stop, continue is a great thing. What should we start doing that we're not doing? What should we stop doing that we are doing? What should we continue doing? Ask everyone that question. The same thing, if you were running this company, what would you do differently? What do you think needs to happen? And, most of the answers that you get won't be of any use. But once in a while, 10% of the time, you're going to get some really good stuff from either customers or employees or team members. Um, but one thing I do ask, I say, never ask your customers what to make because they'll tell you and then they won't buy it. It is not their job. It is not their job to tell you what to do for them. It's their job to complain and give you their struggles and all those kinds of things. And it's your job to say, okay, what could I possibly do that would help that? Similar to Marco's pizza thing, right? He experienced it as opposed to asking. And then he said, okay, now that I understand the struggle, that's the fun part. Let's figure out how to solve that, as opposed to, there's an apocryphal saying to Henry Ford, but it's a really good one, which is if I asked people what they wanted, I would have just made faster horses. He actually never said that, but it's a really good quote, right? And it really makes a lot of sense. Is don't ask them because they will tell you, and that's a problem because they don't know. When we first moved to trains in the 1860s, what did the first train car look like? It looked like a stagecoach because that's what we knew, right? We innovate from what we know forward, and it's just the way our brain works. So you have to get yourself out of that model. That's like asking your customers what to do. But if like Waze did, they asked a different question. Why do you have a map? What job do you hire it to do for you? Where is it letting you down? Okay, now we know all that. What would we do knowing all that? As opposed to, how can I make a better map for you? What features would you like in the map that aren't in the map today? That's just not the right question. So I think you make a really good point.
Cool. So we kind of talked about companies, right, that have both failed and succeeded. When we look at companies that are doing well or leaders and such, are there common characteristics? Are there similarities of those leaders that are successful or that flourish, or companies that flourish? Is there a common thread that weaves throughout them?
So I've found that if you look for attributes, they're all very different, as we talked about a little bit before, right? I've been to so many leadership conferences, where and I see the list of characteristics. Great leaders are these things. They're humble, they're curious, they have integrity, they do this and that. And then I could pick every single, they have charisma. And I could say, Steve Jobs, considered one of the greatest leaders we had, at least in high tech, had little or no integrity, right? The man would buy a new car every 6 months so he could park in the handicap spot. That's not a great human being, right? You've got Warren Buffett, who's really smart, but I wouldn't say he's got a lot of charisma. But they all have something wonderful about them, right? And they leverage that to their greatest extent. So I think there are two things that you need. One is that you have to have some sort of vision. You have to have some sort of thing that compels people to follow you. You must be able to create followers. We can argue whether they're a good leader or not, right? Everyone's going to argue, politics or business, they're a great leader or not. If they create followers, they're a leader. You cannot raise your hand and say, I'm a leader. Leaders are chosen. They're not, you can't declare yourself. You can declare yourself a boss or an authority, but not a leader where people follow you. So that's one thing. You have to have something that draws followers to you. And the other thing, the only attribute that I think is really pretty pervasive across all of these folks is courage. You have to have courage because people are going to tell you their idea is stupid. People are going to tell you don't know what you're doing, especially people who think they know better than you or maybe have had more success than you. You have to have courage to give away your company to your employees so they can run it for you. There's all these things that you have to have a lot of courage to do. So that's the only attribute that I think is across all the others. All the other ones, humble, curious, yeah, they're good, but they don't necessarily apply to everyone or even the great ones. They're all different. So that would be my answer. And I've got I did a whole thing on it. And I actually ran it by who I think, and again, I keep doing your questions ahead of time. I ran it by Alan Mulally, who I think is the greatest leader of our time, if not all time, at least in terms of management science. And he loved it. So that works for me.
I love it. Yeah, I did a whole kind of session. It wasn't, again, podcast hosting is awesome because sometimes we just go off script and we just riff on, topics that are meaningful. And I had this one where we were talking about project management, and it really wound up to like be an episode on courage because sometimes you have to deliver hard messages. You have to have that constitution to be able to be responsible and take responsibility and own it. In good times when you're on time and under budget, and in bad when
Yeah.
things are going off the rails. And it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage to lead a company. It takes a lot of courage to come in as a coach and maybe deliver a message that a company needs to hear that is unpopular.
Yep.
And I think people do their best work when they're coming out of a position of courage.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. There's a great story about John Kennedy, JFK, and after the Bay of Pigs, which was a complete and utter disaster, right? I mean, people were killed and Cubans were killed, and it was just an utter disaster. And he came out publicly and said, "Yeah, I screwed up," and his popularity went up after that, right? Because they're like, he's a human being, right? And he admitted his mistakes. We like that. We like when people come out and sincerely say, "You know what? I just messed up. I'm going to do better next time." And he did, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis, he learned from the Bay of Pigs, and months later, he changed how he did stuff. And the Cuban Missile Crisis came out a completely different, situation than the other because he learned from that. So I think you're right. It's ironically it's better when you show that courage and that vulnerability, or you're willing to say the hard things. People respect you more, and there's certainty in that. They're like, okay, this person's not going to lie to me. We like that, right? That helps us as human beings.
Well, you can at least trust their message at that point, whether you choose as a leader to leverage it and use it or not. But at least you know for sure that they're coming from an honest position. Um,
Yes.
so you had an opportunity to interact with Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Folks are fascinated with Steve. I personally, I use Steve quotes all the time. I mean, I just thought he was just a cool person, minus the car thing. And, he used to race down the freeway at like, 120 miles an hour and, just kind of, it's all about him and such. So he had a little bit of an ego problem, but how was that interaction? Like,
Yeah.
how'd you
So
come away
and
with it?
I have family and friends who actually worked at Apple and worked with Steve directly, and so they have a lot better day to day experience than I did. I actually met him by accident. So I worked for a company called Dragon Systems, which was really the precursor to Siri and things. There were a number of people that worked at Dragon that went on to Apple and helped create Siri. And my territory was the West Coast. So I would drive up and down 101 on a regular basis, visiting all these computer manufacturers and up to Seattle and Microsoft, and they were my clients and such. And I got a meeting at Next. So he was no longer at Apple; he was at Next, and I was just meeting with some product managers, right? And they said, "Oh, we'd love you to come in and just show us, the technology. Where is it at this point in time?" So this was probably 1992, 1993, maybe. I can't remember. It was early mid 90s. I can't remember the exact date. Um, and they said, just hang on, Steve's probably going to join us. And at this point, it's not registering to me. I'm 28 or 29 years old. I'm like, who the hell is Steve? And why are we? Am I? And I'm thinking, did I meet Steve? And I'm going back, like, did I talk to Steve? Should I know who Steve is? I'm in trouble here. I'm sweating. I'm like, oh my God, Steve's coming and he knows me. And then in walks Steve Jobs, right? And it's like, oh, I get it. It's Steve. It is the Steve. And I would tell you, he was gracious. He's probably spent 20, 25 minutes with me. He asked a ton of questions. He asked me to give a demo. He sort of then said, very nicely, just said, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming in, and off he went. It was as soon as I saw him, and I already heard the stories, because again, I had friends that worked for him in the first incarnation, and he was not as good a leader in incarnation number 1 than he was in incarnation number 2. He was kind of a bastard and really hard to work for. sort of a Martha Stewart kind of personality of high tech, sort of mercurial, etc. So I got a little nervous. I'm like, oh God, he's going to rip me to shreds here. And no, he was great. I had no issue. It was actually fun. I mean, you could tell he really got into the technology and enjoyed talking about new things. And so it was a very good experience.
He's to those of us that are in tech, he's like, we just get so protective, right? We want to hear all the good things and we want to ignore all the bad things, and just tell great stories about Steve, who had lots of characteristics of a great leader, and I think he was on his own journey, and later in
Yeah.
life probably came to a bigger realization of, like, wow, um, wish I would have gotten here much sooner so I
Yeah.
could have been a better leader back then. So I
Yeah.
think
And but good for him. I mean, certainly when he was facing death, that changed. But he was humbled by what happened, at Apple, and he worked with Bill Campbell a lot. And Bill Campbell's a no frills, right in your face guy. He respects everyone, but doesn't over respect them, and he would just tell you how it is. Um, and it reminded me a little. I had dinner with Marshall Goldsmith the other night when I was in New York, and he took a bunch of us out, and he was telling his stories, and he said, I said, so what do you do with these executives? Because he coaches like the top, Fortune 500 executives. He's coached 250 or so of them over the last 15, 20 years. And he says, I just basically tell them how it is. And he said, I had this one leader who was the CEO, was a Fortune 10 company. He didn't tell us the name of the guy. And he was bitching and moaning about the owner the whole time. And he's like, life isn't fair. And he's not letting me do what I want to do and blah, blah, blah. And Marshall said, hang on. So life isn't fair. Okay. So he's like, so you got a pretty big house, right? You have a nice house and you kind of have a nice living. Actually, you have 3 or 4 houses, don't you? Yeah. And, you can pretty much travel anywhere you want in the world and in style. Yeah. When your kids go to private school and blah, blah, blah. He says, life isn't fair. And if it was fair, you wouldn't have any of those things. So it's good that it's not fair. And he said, and one more piece of advice: CEO, good. Owner, better. Right? Good, better. Guess what? There, you are the help. I'm sorry, you make millions of dollars a year now. You're the help. Get used to it, or go do something else. And I think these people. I know I read the book about Jobs, and he had some guys, and he surrounded himself with those people, so he would hear the truth, and he got better. I think so. I think that's why. Good for him, right? I mean, he wanted to get better.
I love it. I think we're all on our journeys, right?
Yeah.
Trying to just be the best version of ourselves that we can be. Um, what would you say is your favorite thing about being a coach?
Um, so I'll say 2 things. One is sort of the standard answer, which is, I get to help people and blah, 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 which is great. And I love doing that. I like that look on faces when they're like, oh, right. They sort of figure it out themselves. And, but I really do it for me. It's fun. It is a calling. There's this guy Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi or whatever his name is, the guy who wrote Flow, right? And I'm in flow when I'm with clients. I'm with them for 8 to 10 hard hours, right? These are challenging hours. I'm asking hard questions. They're really digging in. Everyone's tired, but man, it just flies. All of a sudden, it's 5, 6, 7 o'clock, right? And that's so much fun. I get to do that. I don't get to do that enough, but I get to do it. I get to do it 40, 50 times a year, and it's so much fun. It's just a blast. So I think that's why I like being a coach. I love doing startups. They were so great, but they weren't my calling. This is a calling. I love doing this. I would and do it for free very often.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we've covered quite a bit. We've covered a little bit about the book. We've covered a little bit about Bill's personal journey to where he is, and we've shared the failures, the success stories. We geeked out a little bit about Waze. We had a little fun reminiscing about Steve. So I appreciate you, Bill, taking the time, sharing all the information you did. Bill is available out at catalystgrowthadvisors.com. We'll have a link down below in the podcast episodes, so just scroll down, but catalystgrowthadvisors.com. You can also get a link to his book there, as well as his coaching and his some of his offerings, and definitely a link to get in hold of Bill directly if you're interested in some of the other aspects that he does provide from a coaching perspective. So, Bill, again, thanks for making the time and hanging out with us, just talking about leadership. Appreciate
Great.
it.
Thank you for having me on, Michael. It was a lot of fun.
Awesome.